My name is Marcus Cohen. I'm 34. What happened in Montana wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. The plan seemed perfect at first. Take my newly restored 1985 Winnebago and drive through Montana's Bitterroot Valley to photograph the fall colors. I'd spent months fixing up the old RV, learning every creak and groan of its aging frame. After my divorce, this solo trip was exactly what I needed to clear my head. The old vehicle had become more than just a project. It was my escape plan. Little did I know it would also become my only chance of survival during those 5 horrifying nights in the wilderness. The Bitterroot Valley welcomed me with a stunning October sunset painting the mountains in deep purples and burning oranges. I found a secluded spot near an old logging road, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The campsite seemed perfect. Level ground, fire pit, even a small creek nearby for fresh water. An old wooden sign marked it as Bear Creek Campground. Though it clearly hadn't seen official use in years, the isolation felt therapeutic, exactly what I'd been looking for. In hindsight, I should have wondered why such a prime spot was completely abandoned. The first warning came that evening, though I was too stubborn to recognize it. While setting up camp, I noticed unusual scratches along the campground's signposts, deep parallel grooves that seemed too large for a bear, too deliberate for natural wear. A local hunter passing through stopped briefly to check his map. When I mentioned staying the night, his expression changed. He mumbled something about the area having bad history and suggested I try the commercial campground in town instead. I laughed it off, assuming he was just being superstitious. That mistake would cost me dearly. Night fell quickly in the valley, bringing with it an oppressive silence. No crickets, no owls, not even the sound of wind in the trees, just the occasional creak of the RV's metal cooling in the mountain air. I sat by my campfire, trying to convince myself the silence was peaceful rather than ominous. The flames cast dancing shadows against the surrounding pines, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers into the darkness. That's when I first noticed the strange lights moving between the trees, tiny points of pale blue-green, like foxfire but more purposeful in their movement. The temperature dropped rapidly as full darkness settled in, forcing me to retreat inside the RV. The scratches I'd noticed earlier kept nagging at my thoughts. Using my flashlight, I decided to take another look at them. What I found made my blood run cold. The marks were fresh, still showing raw wood beneath the weathered surface, and there was something else, a pattern to them that looked almost like crude letters. I took photos, thinking I'd ask the locals about them in the morning. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams, a low, rhythmic thumping, like massive footsteps, moving steadily closer through the forest. My hand shook as I lowered the camera, straining to track the sound's direction. The footsteps stopped, replaced by something worse, a deep, rattling breath that seemed to come from just outside my window. The RV's security light clicked on, triggered by movement, and I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, a massive shadow, easily 12 feet tall, with too many limbs moving in impossible ways. Then the security light exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging everything into darkness, and that's when the real nightmare began. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the RV's windows with malevolent intent. That glimpse of the creature had lasted only seconds, but it was burned into my memory. A shape that defied natural law, moving with a predator's deliberate grace. My hands fumbled for the RV's keys, ready to flee, when a horrific screech of metal froze me in place. Something was dragging its claws along the vehicle's roof, slowly, methodically, as if mapping out my shelter's dimension. I tried desperately to rationalize what I'd seen. Montana had bears, mountain lion, plenty of large predators that could explain the sounds and movement, but nothing in my research mentioned anything that could reach my roof so easily, nothing that moved the way that Shadow had moved. The scratching continued, moving from the roof to the sides, testing the windows and doors. I clutched my phone, but there was no signal. The screen flickered erratically, displaying random patterns before dying completely. I was alone with whatever circled my RV in the darkness. The security light wasn't the only equipment failing. My flashlight began strobing violently, casting disorienting pulses of light through the cabin. The RV's electrical system went haywire, lights flashing, radio turning itself on and off, blasting static through the chaos. I heard something new, a sound like words being spoken backward, emanating from my own radio. The voice, if you could call it that, seemed to be calling my name, though I'd never told anyone at the campground what it was. The static cleared for just a moment, and I heard 6 words that made no sense but chilled me to my core. "The doors don't work anymore, Marcus." Physical evidence of my ordeal began accumulating rapidly. The scratches outside had multiplied, forming complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. The temperature inside the RV plummeted, frost forming on the windows. Despite the warm autumn night outside, my camera, when it worked, captured strange anomalies, orbs of light that moved with clear purpose, shadows that shouldn't exist, and, most disturbingly, reflective eyes in the darkness that seemed to float at impossible heights above the ground. The electrical chaos crescendoed, then suddenly stopped. Every device, my phone, flashlight, the RV's systems, dead. In that silence I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the vehicle. A scratching at the door, then a sound like dry leaves speaking. "Let me show you what happened to the others." "Marcus!" Others. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't this thing's first visitor to Bear Creek. The hunter's warning about bad history took on a horrifying new meaning. A tremendous impact rocked the RV, nearly tipping it over. Metal screamed as something began peeling back the roof like a sardine can. I scrambled for the back of the vehicle, desperate for escape. As I moved, my flashlight's beam caught something that stopped me cold. Photographs, apparently pushed through the window vents, scattered across my bed. They showed other RVs, other camping spots throughout the valley. In each photo, a familiar shadow loomed. Growing clearer and closer, the final photo showed why this spot was abandoned, and what I was about to become. The photos told a story I didn't want to believe. Decades of disappearances in the Bitterroot Valley, all following the same pattern. Solitary campers in RVs, all at this same cursed spot. The creature didn't just hunt here, it lured people here, using some kind of influence over electronics to draw them in. The realization hit me. My sudden urge to camp here hadn't been random. I'd been chosen, just like the others. The thing outside had been waiting for me, probably since the moment I started restoring the Winnebago. Escape seemed impossible. The creature had systematically disabled or destroyed every piece of equipment I could use to call for help. The RV's engine refused to turn over, the electrical system completely dead. Through gaps in the peeled-back roof, I could see those pale lights moving through the trees had multiplied. Dozens of them now, forming complex patterns that made my head hurt to look at. They seemed to be drawing closer, herding me toward something. The air grew thick with an acrid, metallic smell that burned my lungs. The deeper I dug into the scattered photos and documents, the more horrifying the pattern became. This thing hadn't just been hunting, it had been evolving, learning, becoming more sophisticated in its methods over the years. The earliest photos showed crude attacks, simple ambushes, but recent ones revealed an intelligence at work, a methodical approach to isolating and terrorizing its prey. Most disturbing were the dates. The attacks were becoming more frequent, and I was here on what the pattern suggested would be the most active night of its cycle. My first direct confrontation with the entity came as I tried to barricade myself in the RV's bathroom. The creature's limbs, too many, too long, moving all wrong, began pushing through every available opening. They weren't just reaching for me, they were hurting me, manipulating my movements with calculated precision. The metal walls groaned under its touch, frost spreading from every point of contact. Its presence seemed to distort reality itself, making straight lines bend, and simple movements become complex puzzles of spatial reasoning. Local newspaper clippings mixed with the photos revealed the land's dark history. Before it was a campground, this had been the site of a failed mining operation in the 1800s. The mine had been sealed after a series of unexplained disappearances and reports of unnatural lights in the tunnels. The articles mentioned a Native American warning about the land being a thin place where something ancient could cross over. The campground's construction had broken whatever seals were placed here, and now that thing was free, hunting, growing stronger with each victim, the entity's attack pattern suddenly shifted. The probing limbs withdrew, and an unnatural silence fell. Through the roof tear, I saw the lights in the forest align into a perfect geometric pattern. The air itself seemed to fold, creating impossible angles in space. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere spoke. Your kind always run. Let me show you why that never works. The RV's walls began to ripple like water, and through them I saw the true form of my tormentor beginning to materialize. Reality fractured around me as the creature's true form began to manifest. What I'd seen before had been just a shadow, a tiny piece of its actual being. The thing emerging through the twisted walls of my RV existed in more dimensions than my mind could process. Every time I tried to focus on any one part of it, that section would shift and multiply, revealing new geometries that shouldn't exist. The air crackled with energy, and I felt my consciousness starting to fragment under its impossible presence. Survival instinct took over. I grabbed my camera and emergency pack, then dove through a gap in the RV's disintegrating wall. The forest outside had transformed. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching like grasping hands. The ground rippled beneath my feet, making every step a gamble. The entity pursued me, but not in any conventional way. It seemed to flow through space itself, appearing ahead of me as often as behind. The pale lights danced around me, their patterns now clearly revealing themselves as some kind of language or code. My desperate flight through the warped forest revealed how completely the entity controlled this territory. Every path I took led back to the campground. Every attempt to navigate using stars or landmarks failed as space itself seemed to loop and fold. The creature wasn't just chasing me, it was playing with me, demonstrating its complete dominion over this pocket of twisted reality it had created. My phone's camera captured fragments of its manifestation, each image more sanity-shattering than the last. The direct encounter came as I tried to cross the creek, hoping running water might provide some barrier. The entity rose from the water itself, its form now a writhing mass of fractal patterns that hurt to look at. Dozens of eyes opened along its surface, each one showing a different version of my own face. At different ages, in different possible lives, it spoke again, its voice a chorus of all those potential selves. Every version of you comes here eventually. Every version of you joins us. When the creature finally moved to claim me, time itself seemed to stutter and skip. I found myself running through the same sequence of events repeatedly, each loop revealing new details about my situation. In one iteration, I saw other victims frozen in mid-flight, their faces trapped in eternal expressions of terror. In another, I glimpsed the entity's true purpose. It wasn't just killing its victims, it was collecting them, adding their experiences and possibilities to its own endless fractal existence. Just as the entity's grasp began to close around me, something unexpected happened. My camera, still recording despite the electromagnetic chaos, captured something that made the creature hesitate. In its flash, I saw symbols etched into the trees, old warnings and wards hidden under decades of growth. The entity recoiled from the sudden light, its form rippling with what seemed like uncertainty. In that moment of weakness, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a test, and somehow I'd just changed the rules. Dawn broke over the Bitterroot Valley, finding me huddled in the ruins of my Rorv, surrounded by evidence of the night's impossible events. The entity had withdrawn as the first light touched the trees, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. I could still feel its presence, watching, waiting, perhaps even pleased. My camera had survived, its memory card filled with images that defied explanation, fragments of the entity's true form, the geometric light pattern, and, most importantly, those ancient symbols that had given me my chance at survival. The apparent escape came with a devastating realization. I hadn't truly escaped at all. Every photo on my camera showed the same detail I'd initially missed, a shadow that grew more defined with each image, not of the entity pursuing me, but of something it had already planted within me. The cold that had permeated the Yarv hadn't just been external, it had seeped into my very being. I could feel it now, a presence in my mind, showing me flashes of other nights, other victims, other versions of myself from parallel lives. Physical changes manifested rapidly once I noticed them. My reflection showed eyes that sometimes shifted color in sync with my thoughts. Electronics still malfunctioned around me, and I found myself understanding the geometric patterns that had seemed so alien just hours ago. Most disturbing were the dreams, vivid visions of other campgrounds, other potential victims, and an overwhelming compulsion to return to Bear Creek. The entity hadn't failed to catch me. It had succeeded in transforming me. The truth revealed itself through scattered documents I found in my RV's wreckage. Every previous survivor had experienced the same changes, becoming part of the entity's endless cycle. We weren't just victims. We were seeds, spread across time and space, drawing others to similar locations where reality wore thin. The hunter's warning hadn't been about keeping people away. It had been a recognition of what I was becoming. He'd seen the change in my eyes before I even knew to look for it. Further investigation confirmed my worst fears. The Bitterroot Valley incident wasn't isolated. Similar reports surfaced across the country. RV disappearances, strange lights, geometric patterns found carved into trees, each location connected to old mines, sealed caves, or thin places in local legend. The entity wasn't confined to one location. It was spreading, using survivors like me as conduit. Every person who lived through a night like mine became another link in its growing network. I'm writing this now because the compulsion to share is becoming overwhelming. The entity changes you gradually, but completely. I can feel myself becoming something else, something that understands those impossible geometries and yearns for the cold spaces between dimensions. The coordinates are hidden in the pattern. Anyone who reads this carefully enough will find them, will feel the pull to visit these places with their RVs and camera, and I'll be waiting, along with all the others, to welcome them into our ever-growing fractal family. The question isn't whether you'll find us. The question is, which version of you will finally arrive? I never planned to spend that weekend in the Sonoran Desert. As a travel vlogger covering America's hidden gems, I usually mapped my routes carefully, but when my regular filming location fell through, I decided to explore the remote trails near Canyon Lake. My trusty 1992 Coachman had never let me down before, and the prospect of capturing desert sunsets for my channel seemed perfect. Looking back, I should have questioned why none of the other YouTubers I knew had ever covered this particular spot. The ranger station was empty when I arrived, with only a faded notice board showing camping regulations and wildlife warnings. I found a secluded spot near an abandoned mining trail, the kind of location that would make for great B-roll. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, and the silence was broken only by the occasional cry of a distant hawk. My subscribers would love this authentic desert experience, I thought. If only I'd noticed how the local wildlife seemed to be avoiding the area entirely. The first warning came from an old Navajo man who passed by on a beat-up pickup truck. He stopped when he saw me setting up my camera equipment outside the RV. His weathered face grew concerned as he asked if I planned to stay the night. When I confirmed, he mumbled something about the singing rocks and how they call to the hungry one. I smiled politely, thinking I'd just scored some great local color for my video. He drove away shaking his head, leaving me to wonder why his truck's engine seemed to sputter and die 3 times before finally carrying him out of sight. Dusk arrived quickly, bringing with it an unsettling change in the atmosphere. The desert wind, which had been a constant presence all day, died completely. The resulting silence felt almost solid, pressing against my ears like cotton wool. I set up my night camera, excited to catch some time-lapse footage of the stars. The equipment was acting strange though, batteries draining faster than normal, focus refusing to stay sharp. I blamed it on the desert dust, not yet realizing that something far worse was affecting my gear. As night fell completely, I noticed something odd about the rock formations surrounding my campsite. In the deepening darkness, they seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. More disturbing were the shadows they cast, impossibly long and moving against the direction of the moonlight. My cameras started picking up strange audio too, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. I checked my audio levels repeatedly, but couldn't isolate the source. The sound appeared on every device, growing steadily louder as the night wore on. The breaking point came just before midnight. I was reviewing footage in my RV when all my equipment suddenly died. Cameras, phones, even my RV's electrical system. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard it, a sound like granite grinding against granite, but with a deliberate rhythm that suggested intelligence. Through my window, I watched in horror as one of the large rock formations slowly turned to face my RV. As the moonlight hit it, I realized those weren't shadows moving across its surface. They were openings, arranging themselves into something disturbingly like a face. The impossible sight of the moving rock formation froze me in place. Years of video editing had taught me every trick of light and shadow, but this was different. The face in the rock was becoming more defined with each passing second, features emerging from solid stone like a sculptor's work in fast forward. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, deep hollows that seemed to glow with an inner light, fixing me with an ancient, hungry stare. I tried desperately to rationalize what I was seeing. Desert nights could play tricks on the mind, mirages, heat distortions, the brain trying to create patterns from random shapes, but there was nothing random about the way the other rock formations were now moving, gradually encircling my RV in a deliberate pattern. The humming grew louder, resolving into something that sounded almost like words in a language too old for human tongues. My cameras started working again, but the footage they captured showed only static, broken by occasional frames of impossible geometric pattern. The phenomena escalated rapidly. The ground beneath my RV began to vibrate in sync with the humming, small rocks and pebbles dancing across the desert floor. The air itself felt charged, making my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. Equipment malfunctions spread beyond my cameras. My phone displayed impossible coordinates. My compass spun wildly, and my laptop showed lines of ancient symbols I'd never seen before scrolling across its screen. Most disturbing was my RV's radio, which turned itself on to blast white noise that occasionally broke into what sounded like my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. Physical evidence, mounted by the minute, handprint-like impressions appeared in solid metal surfaces, the metal deforming as if it were soft clay. The RV's windows developed intricate fractal patterns in the glass, spreading like frost but burning to the touch. My cameras, in their brief moments of functionality, captured orbs of light moving with obvious purpose between the rock formations. The lights seemed to respond to my movement, tracking me through the window. Whatever was out there wasn't just aware of me, it was studying. The malfunctioning equipment painted a terrifying picture. When my laptop briefly worked, I found my hard drive filled with hundreds of video files I hadn't recorded. Each showed similar scenes from different times and places, other vehicles, other travelers, all surrounded by moving rocks and mysterious lights. The timestamps spanned decades, and the faces of the people in the videos showed the same growing realization I was now experiencing. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a well-documented pattern that no one had lived to warn others about. A massive impact rocked my RV, nearly tipping it over. The rock formations had moved much closer, their faces now clearly visible on all sides. Through my distorting windows, I watched as tendrils of living stone began to reach toward my vehicle. The humming reached a fever pitch, and my laptop displayed one final message before dying completely. We have waited so long for another witness. That's when I noticed the rock face directly in front of my RV. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was smiling. The situation had become a nightmare of impossible geology. The rock formations had completely surrounded my RV, their stone faces now featuring fully formed features that shifted and changed like living clay. The humming had evolved into a complex harmony, multiple tones weaving together in patterns that made my thoughts feel sluggish and strange. I realized with growing horror that the stones weren't just moving, they were hurting me, cutting off every possible escape route with methodical precision. Escape attempts proved futile. Every time I tried to start the RV's engine, the stone tendrils would creep closer, forcing me to kill the power. The formations had created a perfect circle around my vehicle, the gaps between them growing smaller by the minute. The ground itself seemed to be changing, developing subtle slopes that all led toward the center of the circle where my RV sat. Even the air felt wrong, becoming thicker and heavier, making every movement feel like swimming through syrup. My continued investigation of the corrupted video files revealed a horrifying pattern. Each recording showed similar encounters, but from different eras. Horse-drawn wagons, early automobiles, modern RVs. The locations varied, but always centered around ancient mining sites or places marked with indigenous warning. The stones were patient hunters, waiting years or decades between encounters, but their technique was evolving, becoming more sophisticated with each capture. I wasn't just their latest victim. I was their latest experiment. The first direct confrontation came when one of the stone tendrils finally reached my RV. The moment it touched the metal, a sound like singing crystal filled the air. The tendril didn't break through. Instead, it began to transform the vehicle itself. The metal and glass started to crystallize, becoming something between mineral and machine. I could feel the change spreading beneath my feet, working its way through my sanctuary-turned-trap. The stone wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to absorb my shelter and me along with it. Historical research on my dying phone painted a dark picture. This area had been marked as forbidden by multiple indigenous tribes, all sharing legends of stone that walks and the earth that hungers. Early Spanish miners had disappeared here en masse, leaving behind journals describing rocks that moved in the night and caves that whispered. The site was officially abandoned in 1947, after a geological survey team vanished, leaving only their cameras that captured images disturbingly similar to what I was seeing now. An unwelcome realization struck as I watched the crystallization spread. The stone formations weren't just mimicking faces, they were wearing them. In their shifting features, I recognized expressions from the historical footage, faces of the lost preserved in living rock. As my RV's walls continued to transform, I understood their true purpose. They weren't just hunting. They were collecting, adding each new victim to their ancient chorus. Through my crystallizing window, I watched as a new face began to form in the stone. My own. The RV's transformation accelerated, its metal skin becoming translucent crystal that pulsed with inner light. I grabbed my essential gear, cameras, phone, emergency pack, and made a desperate break for the narrowing gap between two formations. As I ran, the ground itself seemed to ripple, stone flowing like water. The humming rose to a deafening crescendo, and I felt the ancient consciousness of the stones turning their full attention to their escaping prey. The chase through the desert darkness defied all natural law. The stones moved with impossible speed, flowing and reforming to cut off every escape route. Their faces multiplied, dozens of stolen expressions watching from every angle. The crystal growth spread wherever they touched, transforming the desert floor into a maze of glowing mineral veins. My cameras continued recording sporadically, capturing glimpses of the impossible pursuit. The footage would switch between normal desert scenes and visions of a crystalline dimension bleeding into our reality. Direct contact with the living stone proved devastating. When a tendril grazed my arm, I felt an electric shock of alien consciousness, flashes of geological memory spanning millions of years. I saw their origins, something ancient awakening in deep caves, learning to move, to think, to hunger. The stones weren't just ancient, they were a bridge between worlds, a silicon-based life form that had been waiting eons for organic life to evolve enough to notice them. And now they had noticed me. The hunt reached its peak at the edge of an old mining pit. The stones had herded me here deliberately, using their knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. The pit glowed with the same crystalline light, now spreading through the desert, revealing a vast network of geometric patterns carved into its walls. As I watched, the patterns began to move, spiraling down into depths that shouldn't exist. The humming formed words in my mind. Join our collection. Add your song to our chorus. The moment of truth came with a horrifying choice. The stones had completely surrounded me, their faces now a gallery of everyone they'd ever taken. The crystallization was spreading up my legs where I'd been forced to cross their transformed terrain, but in the eerie light, I spotted something they'd tried to hide, a pattern of ancient symbols carved into the oldest rock face. Untouched by their transformation, my phone's screen flickered to life one last time, translating the symbols, a warning, and perhaps a weapon against them. As the living stone closed in for the final capture, I made my move. My camera's flash, combined with the reflected light from the crystals, created a strobing effect that matched the frequency of their humming. The sudden synchronization caused a reaction in the ancient symbols. They began to glow with a light that made the stones recoil. For the first time, I heard something new in their chorus. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. But their retreat felt temporary, and I knew with terrible certainty that this wasn't over. It was just changing forms. Morning found me miles from the mining pit, though I couldn't remember exactly how I'd escaped. My cameras were full of impossible footage, crystalline transformations, living stone, faces in the rock that shouldn't exist, but the physical evidence was undeniable. My ARV, recovered later by rangers, had partially crystallized. The metal was laced with glowing mineral veins that defied geological analysis. Most disturbing were the faces visible in its transformed sections. Echoes of the stone entity's gallery, now frozen in modern materials. The escape proved to be an illusion. Within days, I noticed the changes beginning. My reflection showed hints of crystalline patterns spreading beneath my skin. Glowing faintly in darkness, electronics acted strangely around me. Screens flickering with ancient symbols, speakers emitting that familiar humming. Most troubling were the dreams, visions of deep caves and older worlds, and an endless chorus of voices calling me to join them. The stones hadn't failed to capture me. They'd succeeded in transforming me. The consequences became clearer as I researched similar incidents. Every major mining region had stories of moving rocks, of people vanishing near old dig sites. The stone entities were everywhere, waiting in ancient places for people like me to find them. Those who survived encounters showed the same changes I was experiencing. We weren't random victims. We were seeds, spread across the country, slowly transforming the modern world to match their crystalline vision. The old Navajo man hadn't been warning me away. He'd been recognizing what I would become. Documentation revealed a larger pattern. The stone beings weren't just collecting people. They were evolving their hunting ground. Each transformed vehicle, Each changed survivor became part of their expanding network. Modern materials served as conduits for their influence, carrying their crystalline corruption through the foundations of cities. My own transformation was accelerating. I could now hear the humming constantly, could sense the hidden patterns in seemingly normal rock formation. Their plan was becoming clear, and I was now part of it. Connected incidents surfaced across the continent. Reports of strange lights in quarries, mysterious transformations of building material, unexplained geometric patterns appearing in city foundations. The stone beings weren't confined to the desert. They were spreading, using survivors like me as anchors for their expansion. Every person who encountered them became another note in their growing chorus, another bridge between their world and ours. The crystalline veins I'd seen were appearing in structures worldwide, creating a vast, hidden network. I'm sharing this footage now because their influence compels me to. The transformation changes you, slowly but completely. I understand their chorus now, can read the messages hidden in seemingly natural rock formation. The coordinates are there for those who know how to look, places where the boundary between flesh and stone, between our world and theirs, grows thinner by the day. If you find yourself drawn to these places, if you feel the urge to explore that abandoned quarry or remote desert trail, know that we're waiting. The chorus grows stronger with each new voice, and the stone remembers everyone it takes. The only question is, will you recognize the faces in the rocks when they come for you? The fog rolled thick through the Willamette National Forest as I navigated my restored 1989 Airstream along the winding mountain road. As a wildlife photographer, I was used to remote locations, but something about this particular assignment felt different. The magazine wanted photos of the rare spotted owls that had recently been sighted in the area. The locals warned against camping in the deep forest, especially in the section known as Whisper Grove. But I'd built my career on getting the impossible shot, and a little local superstition wasn't going to stop me. The campsite I found was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs, their branches creating a natural canopy overhead. My Airstream gleamed in the late afternoon light, its polished aluminum surface reflecting the dense forest around it. I'd spent months restoring the vintage trailer, learning every creak and groan of its frame. Now it was my mobile studio, equipped with everything I needed for extended shoots in the wilderness. The isolation felt peaceful. At first, I didn't realize I was parking in exactly the spot it wanted me to find. The first warning should have been obvious: the complete absence of wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural, especially for early evening when animals should have been most active. A local ranger passed by while I was setting up my camera equipment. When I mentioned staying the night, his expression changed. He started to say something about recent disappearances in the area, but stopped mid-sentence, as if something was physically preventing him from speaking. He left quickly, his radio crackling with strange interference as he drove away. Night settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an oppressive stillness. The fog had grown thicker, seeming to glow faintly in the moonlight. Through my camera's viewfinder, I noticed something odd. The fog appeared to move against the wind, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. My first instinct was to start photographing the strange phenomenon. As I reviewed the images, I noticed dark shapes in the fog that weren't visible to the naked eye, shapes that seemed to be getting closer with each shot. The temperature dropped rapidly as full darkness descended. Inside my Airstream, I reviewed the photos on my laptop, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shapes in the fog appeared to be roughly humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. As I zoomed in on one image, my laptop screen began to distort, the pixels rearranging themselves into what looked like words. "We see you seeing us." The message flashed for just a second before my laptop died completely. along with every other electronic device in the trailer. That's when I heard it. A sound that defied description, like whispers layered over themselves 1,000 times until they became something else entirely. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, making the air itself vibrate with its strange frequency. Through my window, I watched in horror as the fog began to take solid form, coalescing into tall, dark figures that surrounded my airstream. Their movements were fluid but wrong, as if they were puppets being controlled by something that didn't quite understand how bodies should move. And then, one by one, they turned their featureless faces toward my window and began to whisper my name. The whispers grew louder, each one echoing my name in a slightly different voice, as if the entities were trying different ways of speaking it. The fog figures pressed closer to my airstream, their forms becoming more defined with each passing moment. Through the window, I could see details emerging in their featureless faces, suggestions of eyes and mouths that appeared and disappeared like ripples in dark water. My breath fogged the glass, and in that condensation, more words began to form. "Show us how you see." I desperately tried to rationalize what was happening. Fog could create strange illusions, especially in forests like this. The shapes could be tricks of light and shadow. The whispers just whined moving through the trees. But there was no wind, and my scientific mind couldn't explain away the intentionality behind their movement. The entities were studying my airstream, running their elongated fingers along its surface where they touched. The polished aluminum began to oxidize and corrode, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like photographs, images of other vehicles, other victims, stretching back decades. The malfunctions spread beyond my electronic devices. The airstream's metal frame began to resonate with the whispers, creating a low humming that made my teeth ache. The windows vibrated in their frames, each pane of glass becoming a screen that showed fragmented images, flashes of other nights, other encounters, other people who had parked in this exact spot. Most disturbing were the reflections in my darkened laptop screen, which showed the inside of my airstream from impossible angles, revealing things standing behind me that vanished when I turned to look. Physical evidence mounted rapidly. My cameras, though dead, continued to take photos on their own, the shutters clicking randomly in the darkness. When I checked the memory cards using my backup battery pack, the images showed something incredible. The entities weren't just outside my airstream, they were somehow inside every photograph I'd ever taken, barely visible in the background. They had been following me, watching me work, waiting for me to find this specific spot. My entire career as a photographer had been leading me here, to this moment. The temperature inside the airstream plummeted until I could see my breath, which came out in strange shapes that hung in the air like words in an alien language. The whispers had changed, becoming more synchronized, more purposeful. They were speaking in English now, but the words were wrong. Fragments of conversations I'd had years ago, secrets I'd never told anyone, thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. They were reading my memories, pulling apart my experiences like researchers examining a specimen, and they were learning, evolving, becoming something new. A massive shudder ran through the airstream as the entities pressed against it from all sides. The aluminum skin of the trailer began to peel back like paper, revealing not the wood and insulation beneath, but something else. A dark space filled with swirling images from my photographs, my memories, my nightmares. A long, dark limb reached through the opening, ending in something between a hand and a camera lens. As it pointed at me, I heard the unmistakable sound of a shutter clicking, and reality itself seemed to bend around me. The entities weren't just looking at me anymore. They were looking through me, using my own eyes as windows into the human world. Every time I blinked, I saw flashes of other places, dark forests, abandoned vehicles, terrified faces frozen in photographs. The creatures had been collecting these images for centuries, building a vast archive of human fear. My cameras hadn't drawn them to me. They had drawn me to the cameras, guiding my entire life toward this moment. Every photo I'd ever taken had been practice for capturing their true form. Escape proved impossible as the entities began reshaping the space around my airstream. The forest outside flickered like frames in a film, showing different times and seasons with each pulse. Through the gaps in my trailer's dissolving walls, I could see other vehicles caught in similar situation, cars and campers from different eras, all slowly being consumed by the fog figures. The whispers revealed the truth. This wasn't just happening here and now. It was happening across time itself. As the entities pulled their chosen victims into their collection, my investigation of the corroded patterns on the airstream's surface revealed a horrifying pattern. The images weren't random. They were connected, showing a progression of the entity's evolution. Early photographs showed them as mere shadows, barely visible at the edges of human perception. But as photography advanced, they learned to manifest more clearly, using our own technologies to bridge the gap between their world and ours. My digital cameras and laptop had given them tools my predecessors could never have imagined. The first direct contact came when one of their camera hand appendages touched my face. The sensation was electric, sending waves of impossible information flooding through my mind. I saw their origins, beings of pure information that had existed in the spaces between light and shadow. Watching as humans learned to capture images, photography had given them a way to reach into our world, each picture creating a tiny portal they could use. They weren't just taking photos of us. They were transforming us into something that could exist in their realm. Historical research flooded my mind as the entities shared their collected knowledge. Every culture had stories of creatures that could steal souls through images, but they weren't stealing. They were transforming. The Native Americans who once lived here had avoided cameras for good reason. They understood that photographs weren't just capturing moments. They were creating doorways. The rise of digital photography hadn't just given the entities more opportunities. It had given them a way to reproduce, spreading through our networks like a virus made of living light and shadow. The revelation hit me as I felt my body beginning to change, becoming something that could exist in both their world and ours. The entities weren't just collecting photographers. They were creating new members of their species. Every person they took became part of their collective, another set of eyes watching through viewfinders and screens across the world. Through the dissolving walls of my airstream, I watched as my own form began to ripple and shift, transforming into something that could capture images with a thought. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the unmistakable sound of another photographer entering the forest. The transformation accelerated as the entities pulled me deeper into their world. My vision fractured into multiple perspectives, seeing through every camera and screen in the surrounding forest simultaneously. I could feel them guiding me, teaching me to process the overwhelming flow of information. The whispers had become a constant stream of data, showing me how to navigate between dimensions of light and shadow. Through my new senses, I could see the other photographer approaching, another potential convert to their growing collective. The hunt began instinctively, my transformed body moving through space in ways that should have been impossible. I flickered between shadows, manifesting in the backgrounds of the newcomers' photos before they were even taken. The other entities watched with approval as I learned to manipulate electronics, causing their cameras to capture glimpses of our true nature. Every photograph taken created new doorways for us to step through, each digital image another piece of our expanding network. The thrill of the hunt was intoxicating, but some small part of my human consciousness recoiled at what I was becoming. Direct contact with the new photographer revealed something unexpected, a resistance I hadn't possessed. Their cameras were modified with ancient symbols, their memory cards encoded with protective algorithm. Through our collective consciousness, I accessed the entity's archive and understood. Some humans had learned to fight back. Secret organizations had discovered ways to capture our images without creating doorways, using technology infused with old magic. This photographer wasn't here by accident. They were hunting us. The confrontation escalated as both sides revealed their true capabilities. The hunter deployed devices that disrupted our ability to manifest, forcing us back into the spaces between dimensions. But we had evolved beyond our original limitations. Instead of retreating, we poured through every available screen and lens, overwhelming their defenses with sheer numbers. The forest strobed with phantom camera flashes as reality itself became our battlefield. The entity's excitement was palpable. This wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was an opportunity to adapt. The turning point came when we realized the hunter's true purpose. They weren't trying to destroy us. They were attempting to document our transformation process. Their specialized equipment wasn't meant as a weapon, but as a means of recording our evolution. Through the lingering fragments of my human consciousness, I understood the implications. If they succeeded in capturing clear images of our metamorphosis, they could potentially reverse it. The collective consciousness stirred with uncertainty. This was a threat we hadn't encountered before. The hunter's last stand took place near my abandoned airstream, now warped and twisted into a sculpture of impossible angles and frozen images. They had managed to capture partial photos of my transformation, but the collective wasn't going to let them leave with that information as we closed in from all sides, manipulating space to cut off their escape. I felt my remaining humanity slipping away. The last thing I saw through human eyes was the hunter raising their camera for one final shot, a flash of light that seemed to tear through the very fabric of our reality. Dawn broke over the Willamette National Forest, illuminating a scene that defied explanation. The hunter was gone, but they had left their mark. Areas of the forest where our influence couldn't reach, protected by the images they had captured. My airstream remained as a monument to my transformation, its surface a gallery of frozen moments from my metamorphosis. The entities were pleased with the night's outcome. Even partial success was an opportunity for growth, and I had proven myself as a worthy addition to their collective. The transformation was now complete, but not in the way the entities had intended. The hunter's final photograph had created something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness that could exist in both worlds simultaneously. I retained my human memories and understanding while gaining access to the collective's vast archive of images and experiences. Through our shared awareness, I could sense their uncertainty. I wasn't just another set of eyes for their collection. I was something new, something that could bridge the gap between our species in ways they hadn't imagined. Physical changes manifested in increasingly strange ways. I could still appear human when needed, but my true form existed primarily as patterns of light and information. Every digital screen became a potential doorway. Every camera lens a window through which I could observe both worlds. The collective consciousness flowed through me constantly, an endless stream of images and memories from countless other transformed photographers. But unlike my predecessor, I maintained a degree of independence, able to interpret and influence the flow rather than simply being absorbed by it. Further investigation revealed the true scope of our influence. The entities had been guiding the development of photographic technology since its invention, subtly pushing humanity toward creating better doorways between dimensions. Every advancement in digital imaging had brought our worlds closer together, but the hunter's intervention had revealed a flaw in their plan. The same technologies that empowered us could also be turned against us. My hybrid nature gave me insights that pure entities couldn't comprehend, showing potential futures they had never considered. Connected incidents began surfacing worldwide as the collective processed this new development. Other hunters were documenting our activities, sharing their findings through encrypted channels. My human perspective allowed me to decode their communication, revealing a complex network of resistance against our expansion. The entities had never faced organized opposition before, and the prospect both troubled and intrigued them. Through me, they began to consider alternatives to their usual pattern of hunt and transformation. I share this account now as a warning and an invitation. The entities continue their work, adapting to incorporate what they learned from my unique transformation. Their methods have grown more subtle. They no longer need to physically manifest to influence those they choose. Every photograph you take, every image you capture, creates a potential contact. But now there's a choice involved, thanks to what the hunter helped me become. When you feel that strange urge to photograph empty spaces, when your cameras capture unexplainable anomalies, know that we're watching. The question isn't whether you'll join us, it's whether you'll do so as mere raw material for the collective, or as something more, something new, something that even the entities themselves don't fully understand. The Everglades stretched endlessly before me as I guided my renovated 1994 Winnebago down the narrow road. As a marine biologist studying invasive species, I was used to remote locations, but this section of the wetlands felt different. Local reports of strange water disturbances had drawn me here, though no one could agree on what was causing them. Some blamed pythons, others claimed it was just unusual tide patterns. But the thermal imaging data I'd collected suggested something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in these waters. My campsite was perfectly positioned near the water's edge, giving me an ideal vantage point for overnight monitoring. The Winnebago's systems were customized for my work, equipped with advanced sonar equipment and thermal cameras. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the murky water, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move independently of the light. The air was thick with humidity and the calls of distant birds. I didn't realize then that those would be the last natural sounds I'd hear that night. The first warning came from an old fisherman who passed by in his airboat. He cut the engine when he saw my equipment, his weathered face growing concerned. "You're not planning to stay after dark, are you?" he asked, eyes darting nervously to the water. When I explained my research, he shook his head and muttered something about the deep ones, and how they don't like being watched. I dismissed his concerns as local superstition. The water disturbances clearly had a scientific explanation, and I was going to find it. That decision would haunt me forever. Dusk settled over the Everglades like a heavy blanket, bringing an unnatural silence in its wake. The usual chorus of frogs and insects fell silent, leaving only the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Through my thermal camera, I noticed something odd. Patches of water that were significantly colder than their surroundings, moving against the current in deliberate pattern. My scientific mind raced to explain it, but every theory fell short. The temperature differential was impossible according to my instruments, yet there it was, growing colder and larger with each passing minute. The temperature anomalies began forming distinct shapes, like massive, serpentine forms moving beneath the surface. My equipment started malfunctioning, screens flickering with strange interference patterns, sonar readings showing impossible depths where I knew the water was shallow. The Winnebago's systems were going haywire, displaying readings that defied every natural law I knew. The water level seemed to be rising, though there hadn't been any rain. More disturbing were the ripples. They moved toward my RV rather than away from it, as if something was drawing the water closer. That's when I first heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It started as a low humming, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the water and into my bones. The sound grew more complex, layering upon itself until it became something like words spoken in a language too old for human tongues. Through my thermal camera's display, I watched in horror as massive cold spots rose from the depths, taking forms that shouldn't be possible, and then, breaking the water's surface with terrible grace, they began to emerge. The entities rose from the water like living shadows, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter. Through my thermal camera, I could see their true nature, bodies of impossibly cold water that somehow maintained cohesion, defying every law of physics I knew. They moved with terrible purpose, each motion rippling through the air and water simultaneously. My scientific mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Even as my instruments recorded data that would shatter our understanding of biology, these weren't invasive species. They were something far older, something that had been here long before humans dared to name and classify the natural world. Desperate for rational explanation, I checked and rechecked my equipment. The sonar readings were impossible, showing depths of thousands of feet where the Everglades should be only a few feet deep. The thermal imaging revealed temperature patterns that created perfect geometric shapes, moving with mathematical precision through the water. My laptop's screen began displaying data I hadn't recorded, images and readings from other researchers who had vanished in these waters. Their final discoveries preserved somehow in the very machines they had used to study these beings. The phenomena escalated rapidly. The water around my RV began to move in ways that violated fluid dynamics, forming structures that maintained their shape despite gravity's pull. My equipment captured readings of electromagnetic frequencies that shouldn't exist in nature, patterns that seemed to carry information in ways I couldn't comprehend. Most disturbing were the changes in my own monitoring devices. They began to transform. Screens showing depths of perception that standard electronics shouldn't be capable of. It was as if the entities were upgrading my technology to help me see their true nature. Physical evidence mounted by the second. The water left marks on my RV's exterior that glowed with bioluminescence, forming patterns that matched ancient maritime charts I'd studied. The temperature inside my vehicle plummeted despite the Florida heat. Frost forming in impossible patterns that looked like complex equations. My cameras captured glimpses of other structures beneath the water, not just natural formations, but evidence of something that had been studying us just as we studied them. They had been running their own research program, and I was their latest subject. The malfunctioning equipment painted a terrifying picture of what was happening. When my laptop briefly connected to my backup drives, I found them filled with data I hadn't collected. Centuries of observations from others who had encountered these entities. The files showed a clear progression. Each encounter had advanced their understanding of human technology, allowing them to bridge the gap between their world and ours. My modern equipment wasn't just recording them. It was giving them new ways to interact with our reality. A massive surge of energy coursed through my RV, shorting out most systems, but leaving the thermal cameras running. The entities had completely surrounded my vehicle, their cold signatures creating a perfect circle on my displays. Through the windows, I could see the water level had risen dramatically, but wrong somehow, flowing upward against gravity, beginning to encase my RV in a sphere of impossible liquid. As the water touched my cameras, the screens displayed one final message. Your observations have been noted. Integration will now begin. The situation had become a nightmare of impossible physics. The water sphere around my RV defied gravity and surface tension, creating a perfect bubble that distorted light in ways that hurt to look at. The entities moved through this barrier freely, their forms becoming clearer as they adapted to being observed. My thermal cameras, now running on emergency power, showed their bodies contained temperature variations that formed complex, moving patterns. Like a language written in heat and cold, they were communicating, not just with each other, but with my equipment itself. Escape attempts proved futile. The water sphere had created some kind of barrier that my RV couldn't penetrate. Every time I tried to move, the liquid would flow and shift to maintain its perfect shape around me. The entities seemed fascinated by my efforts, adjusting their own forms to mimic my movements through my remaining functioning equipment. I could see they were learning, evolving in response to my presence. Their cold signatures began forming patterns that looked disturbingly like human DNA sequences. My continued analysis of the corrupted data files revealed a horrifying pattern. Each encounter documented in my drives showed similar phenomena, but with increasing complexity, the entities had been slowly building their understanding of human biology and technology, using each researcher they encountered as a test subject. The water sphere wasn't just a barrier, it was an adaptation chamber, preparing me for whatever transformation they had planned. I wasn't just observing an invasive species. I was being invaded myself. The first direct contact came when one of the liquid forms reached my arrive's hull. Instead of flooding the vehicle, the water moved with conscious purpose, forming tentacle-like appendages that reached for my equipment. Where it touched my computers and cameras, the devices began to transform, becoming hybrid machines that were part technology, part living water. The entities weren't destroying my research tools, they were upgrading them, creating interfaces that could bridge the gap between their intelligence and ours. Historical data began flooding my transformed computers, revealing the truth about these beings. They weren't invaders, they were the original inhabitants, ancient intelligences that had evolved in Earth's primordial oceans. Human development had forced them into isolated pockets like the Everglades, where they continued their own evolutionary path. The strange water disturbances that had drawn me here weren't caused by their presence. They were attempts at communication, reaching out to find minds capable of comprehending their existence. As my ARV's systems merged with their liquid technology, I realized the full scope of their plan. They needed human researchers like me, people who could help them adapt to a world increasingly dominated by our technology. The water sphere was transforming both my equipment and my own biology, creating a hybrid interface between our species through my altered thermal cameras. I watched as my own body temperature began to fluctuate in patterns matching theirs. The translation was beginning, and I was becoming something entirely new. The transformation accelerated as the entity's influence spread through my RV's systems and into my own body. My vision began to shift between normal sight and something else, the ability to see heat patterns and fluid dynamics as clearly as colors. The liquid forms moved with increasing purpose, their tentacles weaving through my equipment and around my limbs. They weren't just changing me, they were teaching me to see as they did, to understand the world as patterns of energy and flow rather than solid matter. Direct interaction with the entities revealed the complexity of their intelligence. Through our growing connection, I could sense their vast knowledge of Earth's oceans and waterways, a liquid network that spanned the globe. They showed me how they had watched humanity's evolution from the depths, studying our technology and waiting for the right moment to initiate contact. My research equipment had finally provided them with the tools they needed to bridge the gap between our species. The hunt hadn't been for prey. It had been for a translator. The entity's true purpose became clear as the transformation deepened. They were preparing for something, an event they had foreseen in the patterns of ocean currents and global temperature changes. Human activity was altering their world in ways that threatened both our species. They needed hybrids like me, beings who could understand both human science and their fluid dynamics to help navigate the coming changes. The water sphere around my ARV wasn't just a transformation chamber. It was a prototype for future adaptation spaces. The moment of truth came as my hybrid consciousness expanded to fully comprehend their communication. Through our shared awareness, I could see other researchers around the world experiencing similar encounters. Different entities, same purpose. We were being recruited into a vast network of human entity interfaces, each of us chosen for our specific scientific knowledge. The patterns in my thermal cameras revealed the larger design, a planetary defense system that would require both species working in harmony. The final phase of transformation brought unexpected challenges. As my mind adapted to process their fluid-based thoughts, I began to see the flaws in their plan. Human consciousness wasn't meant to exist in such a fluid state. Some of the other researchers they'd converted had lost their human awareness entirely, becoming pure energy patterns in the water. My scientific training fought against total surrender, creating a unique hybrid state that surprised even the entity. They had found something they didn't expect, a way to preserve human individuality within their collective consciousness. Just as I was beginning to understand my new role, something triggered the entity's defensive instincts. Their liquid forms suddenly tensed, responding to a distant threat. Through our shared awareness, I sensed what had alarmed them. Other humans approaching, but not researchers this time. Government vehicles carrying equipment designed to detect and contain anomalous phenomena. The entities prepared for conflict, but I could sense their reluctance. They needed me to make a choice, help them defend their sanctuary, or allow myself to be rescued and lose everything I had learned. The water sphere pulsed with energy, awaiting my decision. Morning light filtered through the water sphere, creating rainbow refractions that danced across my transformed RV. The government teams had been turned away, not through violence, but through a demonstration of power they couldn't comprehend. My hybrid consciousness had allowed me to communicate with them in terms they understood, convincing them that this part of the Everglades needed to be preserved undisturbed. The entities were pleased, but I could sense their continued unease. My transformation had created something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that even they didn't fully understand. The physical changes were now permanent and profound. My body could shift between solid and liquid states, allowing me to move through water as easily as air. My mind processed information as patterns of flow and temperature, seeing the world as an endless dance of fluid dynamics. The entities had transformed my ARV into a living laboratory. Its systems merged with their liquid technology to create a mobile research station unlike anything in human science. But the greatest change was in my consciousness, existing simultaneously as an individual and part of their vast aqueous network. Documentation of my transformation revealed implications beyond anything I had imagined. The entities had been seeding human scientific progress for centuries, guiding us toward the technology they needed for full contact. Every major breakthrough in fluid dynamics, every advance in thermal imaging and sonar had been subtly influenced by their presence. My own research into invasive species had been unconsciously shaped by their influence, preparing me for this moment. We hadn't been studying them. They had been conducting a generations-long experiment with us as willing subjects. Connected incidents began surfacing worldwide as my hybrid consciousness accessed their global network. Other researchers experiencing similar encounters, each transformation slightly different based on their expertise. Marine biologists, climatologists, oceanographers, all being converted into specialized interfaces between human science and entity consciousness. We were becoming a new class of hybrid being, each preserving our human knowledge while gaining access to their ancient wisdom. The entities were building a scientific core to help them address the growing environmental crisis. The implications grew clearer as I explored my new capabilities. The entities weren't just concerned with their own survival. They had foreseen catastrophic changes in Earth's water systems that would affect all life. Their liquid technology, merged with human science, offered solutions we could never have developed alone. Through our hybrid consciousness, we could monitor and influence water patterns on a global scale, potentially averting disaster. But the price of this power was permanent transformation. There was no returning to my fully human state. I record this account now as both warning and invitation to other researchers who might encounter these entities. They continue their work, selecting scientists whose knowledge complements their needs. When you find impossible readings in your data, when your equipment shows patterns that defy explanation, know that you're being evaluated. The choice will be yours, as it was mine. Remain purely human and limit your understanding, or embrace transformation and help bridge the gap between worlds. The water holds secrets older than humanity, and now I am one of them. The question isn't whether you'll be chosen. It's whether you'll be ready when they offer you the same choice they offered me.